Hey y'all, Eric Estep here. I want to welcome you all to the audiobook edition of The Legend of Groovy Hollow. The annual Groovy Hollow iRacing event is all about supporting Extra Life, a Children's Miracle Network Hospitals program. So to thank you all for your generous support over the years, we bring you The Legend of Groovy Hollow, a novel written by Cody Williams and performed by Jillian Cool. Tommie is finally back out on the track with Amelia, but it's still unknown if Groovy Hollow will return for a fourth year. And would Tommie even make it up against the pros, much less an unbeatable racer like Bucky Blackwell? Let's find out in the exciting conclusion to The Legend of Groovy Hollow.
Chapter 27. Tommie first tested the revamped edition of Amelia, the new gray ghost, at Kingsport Speedway that April. Dad had tried to book a date at Groovy Hollow, but as with the last couple of years, the phone line was busy. He must have tried every number and email provided on the Contact Us tab of the Groovy Hollow website, but to no avail. The phone lines were always busy, and the emails went unanswered. Even the Facebook and X pages remained dormant after the last event, as they were nearly every year until the weeks just prior to the current year's race. But in spite of this, she knew that a Groovy Hollow 4 would take place. It had to. And it would in time. She just needed to be patient. There was a good deal of rust on her for the first test session in Kingsport. She ran her first handful of laps slow and off the pace, just wanting to get a feel for the car. At first, it was uncomfortable and terribly loose. She almost spun a number of times, none more scary than when she entered the first corner. She thought she had lost the car right then and there and tensed up. A lightning bolt of pain struck through her leg, reminding her of her past injury. She wasn't afraid of getting hurt again. Rather, she feared hurting the car. The last thing she ever wanted to do was to back Amelia into the wall. That would only mean more work for her and her dad, and the work would be in a pinch. She wasn't even sure they'd have the time and money to fix the damage with the race looming in just a few months. But she saved the car and didn't crash it, thanking her lucky stars. When she started to increase speed, she felt a little more comfortable in the driver's seat. After all, it had been a while since she had driven anything at all, let alone something in a real competition. After about 50 laps of practice, she still wasn't fully up to race speed, but was inching closer to that goal with each passing lap. There were a lot of distractions in the car that day. Distractions that she'd never really shake. Her leg injury, nerves, and doubts about her ability aside, she also got a strange sensation she was not alone. With a Hans device required, she couldn't move her head to look behind her. Obviously, there was no passenger seat beside her, but she imagined a darkened, misshapen figure clinging to the roll cage bars, like a daredevil living a most extreme dream. She strained her eyes to see, but the helmet got in the way. That was one of those times she nearly lost it. The rear of the car stepped out behind her, and she had to chase it up the track. She came within an inch, maybe less, of making contact with the outside wall. Dad came over the radio. "How you holding up in there, Tommie?" Tommie snapped her attention back to the task at hand and tried to put that feeling of another presence as far out of her mind as possible. "Fine, Daddy, just a little rusty," she said, and it was true enough. "All right, then, just don't press it too hard, okay? Remember the big picture, okay?" 10-4, she said, and got back to driving the preferred line around the circuit. The tires were completely shot after about a 75-lap run. She brought the gray ghost down pit road and parked it at the stall adjacent to the start-finish line. Dad was beside her in a hurry, yanking down the window net. "How was that?" he screamed over the rumble of the engine. Tommie shut it off and loosened her belts. She climbed out and took off her helmet and Hans device, placing them on the roof of the car beside her name. "That was fun," she said, which was, of course, the understatement of the year. She popped out her earplugs and dangled them around her neck as she adjusted her hair. "Harder than I remember, but still a blast. I missed it." "Well, I'm sure Amelia missed you," Dad said, but Tommie ignored him. She lowered herself, taking in a good look at the passenger side of the car. There was no figure there, no ghostly presence to make her uncomfortable or fearful. Dad looked too and asked, "What are you looking for?" Tommie stiffened and shook her head. Nothing, I'm sure it was nothing. But she was deeply unsettled and not herself. Dad cocked an eyebrow and waited for further explanation. When none came, he said, "Well, you were slow at first, but that's okay. It's hard to ride that horse when you've been off it for so long, especially considering how the last go-around went. But you picked it up, and quicker than I honestly expected. You were going nearly race speed around lap 30 or so. Did you feel like you were back?" "I don't know," Tommie said honestly. "Really, I don't feel like I ever left. Or at the very least, it never left me." Dad nodded and got back to his analytics. But it was a steady decline until lap 50 when lap times took a nosedive. "Did you notice a huge difference in handling? I saw that you had a bad moment around the time the steeper fall-off occurred." How can I tell him I almost wrecked the car because I was spooked by a shadow I never saw? She didn't know, so she didn't fess up to that at all. Rather, she simply said, "Yeah, there was a difference for sure, and it caught me off guard a time or two, but no, I don't think it was too big of a difference in terms of handling. Once I got the hang of it, it was fine. On edge at times, but still mostly fine." Dad smiled and patted her on the shoulder. "Well, that's just fine, honey. I'm proud of you, you know. It took a lot of guts to get back in that car after the accident. A lot of drivers, they lose their footing after something like that. You done good." "Thanks," she said, unsure of what else to say beyond it. "I don't want to go through another set of Hoosiers. They're expensive. Why don't we call it a day? I heard your mom was fixing a meatloaf dinner with all the fixings. You can tell her how the test went, calm her nerves a little." Tommie smiled and nodded. The two of them packed up, loaded up the car, and headed for the house. Dinner was ready and on the table by the time they got there. Tommie happily helped herself to a thick slice of the meatloaf and poured a liberal helping of extra ketchup on top. Additionally, she plopped a big spoonful of mashed potatoes onto her plate and covered it with corn and mac and cheese. A lot of people don't like their food touching one another, which Tommie never got. A lot of little kids especially were like that. She recalled a time when she was younger and at a birthday party when a boy devolved into a screaming mess when his ice cream melted into his cake. Tommie, she couldn't have cared less. She mixed the two, and then just as she mixed her pasta, corn, and even a little bit of the ketchup from the meatloaf into her potatoes, she chowed down contently. It was all going to the same place anyhow, and the food was scrumptious. It was easily the best darn meatloaf Mama had ever made. Tommie was sure to tell her just that, too. "You've outdone yourself, Mama. This is delicious." "Well, thank you, sweetie." There was a twinkle in her mother's eye. She took a bite of the food herself and chewed it up in a hurry. Then she asked, "How did testing go today?" "It went well," Dad said. He turned and smiled at Tommie. "Just like riding a bike, ain't it?" "Yeah," Tommie agreed, though she herself had never learned to ride a bike, not without training wheels at least. That was one of her primary regrets. At 10 years old, she was still sporting her trusty training wheels. Some of her classmates poked fun at her over it. If that wasn't enough to get her to forego learning to ride a bike altogether, the crash into an angry flock of geese down by the river surely did her in. She vowed then to never get back on a bike, be it a regular one or a motorcycle. It was strange whenever she stopped to think about it, though. She shunned bikes out of fear, but climbed willingly into a late-model stock with the intention of one day going 200 miles per hour on the NASCAR circuit without a second thought. "Well, good," Mama said and helped herself to another bite. "Were your times, I don't know, good? Fast, I mean?" She got up to about what race pace is over at that track. Not quite up to snuff in the qualifying trim yet, but she'll get there, I'm sure of that. "That's what we're going to do next, Tommie. We'll go over to Kingsport and test qualifying setups. We know what the car does on the Hoosiers for the long run. Now we just need to get the short run figured out, and we'll be all set." Tommie nodded her agreement. Mama said, "I really wish you could get in and test over at Groovy Hollow. She needs to turn laps on that track if that is where she's going to race." "I agree," Dad said, "and I've tried. Nobody will return my calls, my emails, my Facebook messages. Heck, even my Twitter messages." "It's X now, Dad," Tommie said and laughed a little. Dad looked at her with squinted eyes. He flicked a kernel of corn at her. Don't even get me started on that stupidity. It'll always be Twitter in my head. Anywho, most likely the first laps Tommie makes at Groovy will be when the race weekend starts. That's ridiculous. When is that? Don't know yet, Tommie said, amplifying her frustration. But she smiled at her dad to assure him that she'd be ready whenever the time came. That bunch is AWOL, Dad declared. True. They'll make an announcement by September, though. They always do. Tommie reassured them. Maybe they just won't have one this year, Mama added. They will, Tommie said positively. They'll race at Groovy Hollow this year. They'll race there every year that the track is standing, she thought. Her mind wandered then. She wondered when or if the track would disappear again. And if it happened, would it ever resurface? The uncertainty of that made Tommie's stomach rumble, and she suddenly lost her appetite. Still, she forced herself to clean her plate. Mama worked so hard on it, and it was her favorite meal. When she was done eating, Tommie stood up. She pushed her plate away and excused herself. She told them it was her bedtime. Mama and Dad nodded their understanding. She kissed them both on the cheek and headed upstairs to call it a night. As she slipped into her pajamas, she texted Carol. Turned my first laps today. I'm a little rusty, but it felt good to get back out there. Hope you're doing okay. Just before she drifted off to sleep, her phone dinged. Carol wrote back, All's well on this end. I'm glad you're back on the track. Looking forward to Groovy Hollow. Love, Carol Oates. Tommie smiled and snickered at this. For what it was worth, Carol seemed to be adapting very well to her new phone. Tommie was already asleep and snoring when her closet door popped open. The darkness inside ate away at the light. If she could have seen what was inside, she would have seen the pale blue face of Jerry Slater staring back at her, with his slacked jaw and sunken eyes. But she didn't see. She slept on, dreaming about racing and going fast. Chapter 28. Registration for the annual Groovy Hollow 300 dropped on Friday, September 13th at around noon, prior to any official announcement. The news came as a surprise to Tommie, and she likely wouldn't have ever known about it if she didn't get a text from Carol shortly after the applications were posted online. The text from Carol read, Got an email today from Groovy Hollow Raceway. When can you come over? Tommie texted back, Let me clean up and I'll be right there. Been working on Amelia all afternoon. Tommie excused herself from her dad and said that she needed to get washed up. Dad said he'd likely continue tinkering around with the car until dinner. Will you be back for dinner? Dad asked. In truth, Tommie didn't know the answer, but said, sure. She left the garage and went in the house, careful to kick off her greasy work boots before trotting upstairs and taking a shower. She didn't bother with makeup or the clothes she would wear. She just threw on a pair of wrinkled jeans and a dirty t-shirt that didn't smell too offensive and left the house. She got to Carol's at about 3:15. She killed the engine and walked up the long front walk to ring the doorbell. While she waited for Carol to answer, she lamented just how much she liked Carol's home. It was an old house built in the Victorian style. It was the type of house that would be great for hosting an annual haunted house attraction for the Halloween season. Tommie thought that maybe she'd be able to convince Carol to host such an event, but the side of her that was more rational doubted that her elderly friend would get behind such a juvenile stunt. Besides, Carol hardly had the same love of horror movies and books that Tommie had. The old house groaned, settling into its eternal location. She could hear every footstep Carol made towards the door, them increasing in volume as she approached. Finally, she opened the door. It was dark on the inside and musky smelling. Tommie winced at the old dusty odor as Carol waited for her eyes to adjust to the bright white light of the outside world. Tommie, yes, come on in, the old woman said and turned to lead Tommie deeper into the house. Tommie was sure to shut the door behind her, closing out the sun's light. My desktop is in the dining room. I'll go boot it up. Before you come in here, Tommie, could you please empty that blasted dehumidifier? You can empty it out in the sink. Carol went and sat down at the desk on the dining room table. It wasn't so much a desk as an old antique pedal-powdered sewing machine. She turned the computer on, an old white Dell with a fat back monitor and tower that made digestion noises as it started to run. Tommie emptied the dehumidifier and put the empty Bucky back in it. There, that'll help with that smell, she thought. It wasn't that it was a particularly foul smell. It just smelled of old and close to rotting wood. The dehumidifier kicked on and started sucking out the moisture in the living room. Tommie went to join Carol in the dining room, where she had her Yahoo email account pulled up. It was different than Tommie's own email, as she had never been accustomed to anything but Gmail. Carol clicked on the first email on the screen to open it. See, here it is. Tommie leaned in closer to get a better look. She read the email while moving her lips. The email read, Miss Carol Oates, we here at the Groovy Hollow Raceway hope you're doing well and have fully recovered after your unfortunate incident at the track during Groovy Hollow 2. To extend an olive branch, we offer you this special invitation to race in this year's 4th annual Groovy Hollow 300 at the infamous Groovy Hollow Raceway. Please fill out this online application if you wouldn't mind. We look forward to seeing you back on the track soon. An official announcement is pending. Best, Doug Richards, owner and operator of Groovy Hollow Raceway Incorporated. Can you believe this mess? Carol asked. Last year was my last ride. I was certain of that before I climbed in the car. But now look at me, even if I wanted to get back in behind the wheel, which I don't. Tommie looked at her. She saw the certainty of Carol's face, but she still had doubts. She believed the fire to race was still in there somewhere, and that it burned brighter and hotter now than it did even a year ago. I'm not able to no more. Who do these people think they are, taunting an old woman like this? Are you sure that's what they're doing? Tommie asked. She scrolled to the bottom of the email and then back to the top. She looked closely at the email. Doug Richards at groovyhollowinc.com. Looks legit. Oh, I'm sure it is legit, Tommie. That's not the point. They should know darn well the condition I'm in after that wreck, even all these months and months later. Do you mind if I forward this to myself? Tommie asked. No, go ahead. Hey, you should use this application to sign up, Carol suggested. If it works, Tommie said. She clicked the forward arrow on the top right corner of the screen and typed in her own email address to send it to herself. She pressed send. There. I'll give it a better look over when I get home. What do you want me to do? Carol asked. Tommie shrugged. Ignore it, I reckon. You're not going to race anyway, right? Shoot no, Carol exclaimed. There were pools of tears in her eyes that shimmered with the realization that her last ride ended with a brutal crash. Tommie figured that somewhere deep down, Carol truly believed that someday she'd get another chance at that proper last ride. But now she knew that someday would never come. Okay, Tommie said lamely. It was all she could think to say. Telling Carol just how sorry she was for losing her passion would likely do more harm than good. She checked the phone just to make sure the email had been received. It had. She kissed Carol on the cheek and left accordingly, promised that she'd be back for a longer, more proper visit soon. When she got home, she told Dad about the application and how she forwarded it to herself via Carol's account. You're signing up? It was more of a rhetorical confirmation than a genuine question. Tommie nodded. Yep, I'd figure I'd go up and do that right now. You go, girl, Dad called as she left the garage for the house proper. In the living room, Mom was playing a game of solitaire on the coffee table and losing. She was looking down at the hand she was given with perplexed misgivings. When she heard the doorbell chime and Tommie walk in, closing the door quietly behind her, she looked up and smiled. She rehashed the story of the application Groovy Hollow sent Carol. That poor woman, she can't race, Mom said. An impolite thought when blurted out, especially if it had been in front of Carol, but not one that was altogether untrue. She's not racing, Mama. Tommie swallowed hard. I am. She told her Mama that she forwarded the invitation to herself and intended to fill it out as soon as she got back upstairs. Mama didn't interrupt her, not even once, but a look of discomfort did wash over her face. Tears started to pool in her deep baby blues, but Tommie didn't address it. Mama blinked. Well, that's all fine and good, sweetie. Your dad and I'll be there, cheering you on. Thanks, Mama. Tommie turned and started up the stairs before Mama stopped her. Oh, honey, I almost forgot. You have something in the mail, a letter. There's no return address, so it likely didn't come via the post. Mama stood up and went to the kitchen. She returned with a letter-sized envelope in hand. It was unopened. I didn't open it, Mama said, stating the obvious. It doesn't seem too thick, though. Like I said, it's probably a letter, though I'm not sure who communicates that way much anymore. Tommie took the envelope from her mother's hand. The address was written across the face of the white, almost transparent envelope in messy handwriting, tattooed in bolded blue ink. It was addressed to her full name, Tommie Jo Swanson. Tommie ripped it open. It wasn't a letter at all, but rather a photograph taken from what looked like across the street. It showed their house with an open garage door. Dad was working on Amelia. Tommie was nowhere to be found. She looked at her mom with a sense of surreal confusion. Mama saw the look on her face and hurried over to check out the contents of the envelope for herself. Oh my? She asked, along with the litany of other unanswerable questions. Tommie blotted them out. She faded, thinking of all the possibilities, most of them dark and twisted, of what this could mean. Was it a threat? A promise? It hardly seemed harmless. Tommie decided that she couldn't deal with this right now. She left the Polaroid with her mama and ran upstairs. She had a race to apply for anyhow. Chapter 29. The official announcement of the 4th annual Groovy Hollow 300 was posted online by Eric Estep's Out of the Groove YouTube channel, as per usual on October 18th at noon. The video was grainy, possessing that old-school throwback feel Tommie had grown to expect from Groovy Hollow's announcements. Eric hyped up the return of Bucky Blackwell and his infamous Halloween machine, and even dropped some hints that the Junkyard Jacks may make an appearance or two. Her name wasn't mentioned, not that she really expected it to be. By all accounts, she was expected to be a back martyr entry, assuming she even made the field. It also wasn't said how many cars were attempting to make the race, but she figured that it would be an entry or two above the allotted 40. As she watched the video and saw the archival footage of the previous year's races, Tommie began to feel her throat tighten. Her nerves were starting to get the best of her, and she swallowed hard in hopes of choking them down. Now was not the time for anxiousness, not with a race on the way. Appearing again in the race, as announced by Estep, were the Groovy Hollow loyalists who always made an appearance, David Smith and Brandon Power, among a couple of other faithful. The video ended with a grainy image of a mock cemetery, perhaps in the track's infield. Tommie exited out of her video and sat there in a ponderous silence for a few minutes. Then she heard a scratching sound. She looked up and around, her eyes darting from wall to wall in an attempt to find the source. After a few seconds of dizzying disquiet, she determined that the sound was coming from the closet behind her. Tommie stood up, and her initial instinct was to back away. She pressed her backside against the window overlooking the front lawn. The cool glass was cold to the touch, so cold, in fact, that it nearly burned. She looked over her shoulder and could see the garage down below. The door was left slightly ajar, and just when Tommie started to get concerned at the possibility of someone in there messing with Amelia, she heard the metallic turn of a doorknob. Tommie gnawed on her bottom lip and stifled a scream. The last thing she wanted at that moment was for Dad to come running to her room. She wasn't a child anymore, and she was way too old to be scared of monsters in her closet. But intruders, that was a whole different story. Tommie had seen enough slasher flicks, as well as movies about ghosts, ghouls, and demons, to know that the real threat, in any case, was a psychopath who was all too human. The closet door popped open. There was an uncomfortable sound of whooshing air. Tommie felt the room around her grow cold, and she studied the space immediately in front of her, wondering if she'd be able to see her foggy breath. The closet door opened slowly. It groaned and moaned painfully on its rusted hinges. Darkness crept in. Inside the closet, the black atmosphere of the unknown was more pronounced, bolded somehow, accented to the most unsettling extremes. Amidst that writhing black atmosphere, she saw deep within its twirling nest of shadows. the illuminated blue face of Jerry Slater. He grimaced painfully and opened his mouth as if to speak, but his words, those terrible chants, fell upon deaf ears. Tommie ran across the room. She felt the darkness caress her shoulders as she leaped over her bed and pulled open her bedroom door. She flicked the main overhead light switch on, and her bedroom became ignited by yellow rays of light. It ate away at the darkness, leaving Tommie to feel a little better. Still, she lingered on the threshold of her door, scared to go back inside her quarters. She looked at the closet. There was nothing there but a mess of dirty clothes on the floor and clean outfits hanging up neatly. She waited a minute, 2, 3, by the 4th. She took a cautionary step towards the closet, reaching out, ready to defend herself if something or someone reached out from her laundry and tried to grab her. She opened the closet door a little wider. She took another step back. Then she found her courage and reached in, rummaging through her closet. The clean clothes that were hung up fell to the floor and mingled with the dirty clothes. She reached to the back of the closet and touched the wall. She knocked on it. Solid. She reached to the right and to the left, nothing but a wall on either side, separated only by now largely empty clothes hangers. It was my imagination, she thought with some relief, but also with the horror that she was losing her freaking mind. Tommie backed away, not towards the door, but to the window. She never once fully took her eyes off the ajar closet door, even when she glanced over her shoulder and out the window at the garage door that was now shut. More imaginary practical jokes? She kept it firmly within her periphery. She was relieved when nothing slithered out of the door in the confused haze of her concerned vision. Tommie thought of Jerry Slater, and though she tried to push the mental image of him far away from her mind's reach, it kept coming back to her like a ship returned to her by the consistency of an ocean's tide. Abruptly, she figured that she ought to go down and check on Amelia. She walked to the door, stepping over her bed again, sure not to get within reach of the closet door. Though she did wonder in the back of her head if distance really would stop such a mad intruder, and bolted down the hall. Dad must have heard the heaviness of her footfalls on the first-floor ceiling, because he stopped her as she rounded the banister and darted for the front door. "Whoa, Tom, where's the fire? More importantly, what's the fire?" Tommie did her best to put on a straight, self-assured face. She swallowed her lies. "No fire, Daddy. I just wanted to go out and see Amelia." "Any particular reason why?" "Nope," she said as calmly and as matter-of-factly as she could. Dad nodded and smiled. "Oh, I see. One of those strange driver quirks. Did you see Eric's announcement video?" "I did. Have you heard back from the office over there? Have they looked at your application?" "No, I don't know. I'm going to assume yes, but I'm sure I'll get an email of some sort in the next week or so, maybe even tomorrow." "Okay, well, just—" Tommie didn't hear the end of her father's sentence. She was out the door, heading for the garage before he could finish. "Hang on," she said, trying to delude her own rudeness. "I'll be right back." Outside, the sun was fading over the hills. Its dying light cast a bruised purple hue on it, and the moon shone brightly. It was big and commanding. She stood for a moment, unmoving, outside of the garage. She wondered if the intruder was still in here, though she doubted it, more willing to play the whole evening off on her overactive horror movie imagination. She entered the security code on the outside carefully, and the garage door shook and rattled in its track as it rose. Tommie prepared herself for a shock like a good plot twist, preparing a scream in her throat, but it died there, and the garage came to full view as if the scene was anticlimactic. But she felt a strange mix of relief and disappointment. There was nobody in the garage. Not that you can see. Her superstitious self prodded, but she shook it off. Amelia slept alone beneath her sheet, undisturbed. Cautiously, Tommie stepped inside. She ran her hand along the rear deck lid and tugged gently at the spoiler. "Soon," she said. "Real soon," Dad said from behind her. Tommie jumped. Her heart leaped up into her throat. She gagged, feeling as though she was choking. She turned to face her father. He was smiling at her good-naturedly, standing with a slouched posture and his hands shoved deeply into his pockets. It was his aw shucks stature. He walked further inside and met her at the car's rear bumper. He too stroked the sheet covering the rear of the car. He looked at her and his expression changed. He stiffened, becoming alert, bordering on alarmed. "Tommie, are you sure you're okay? You're white as can be. You look like you've seen a ghost." Tommie flinched at the word ghost. Was that what form of existence Jerry Slater was regulated to after he passed? Maybe, but she had her doubts. Most of all, she hoped that wasn't the case. Being a ghost had to be the most haunting experience anyone could ever have. And why would he choose her? She turned and looked at Amelia. She was his baby first. What was it about ghosts and cars? Tommie thought of Christine by Stephen King and smiled. She always liked that book, despite its odd shift from first to third person halfway through the book. The movie was better in her opinion, and it was one of the rare instances where the film adaptation beat out the source material in her mind. But she liked the backstory of the car better in the book. In the movie, the titular Christine was born bad. She took her first victim in the film's opening shot, while Christine was still on the production line. In the book, though, Christine was a haunted car, haunted by the ghost of her former owner, an evil and bad man. She didn't think that Amelia wasn't haunted, or maybe she just refused to consider it. Whatever the case, she dropped the thought, denying its possibilities. Bad dream, Tommie lied. She had heard before that it was possible for someone to experience a dream while technically being awake. And though she wasn't laying in bed and experiencing a fit of sleep paralysis, it did seem like a better explanation if she ever abandoned her previous theory that her imagination had conjured up the ghost of Jerry Slater. The car was untouched, unharmed. That was good. Now she ought to be able to rest easy, right? Dad nodded his acceptance of her explanation. Tommie let go of the spoiler and turned to face her father. "I'm wiped," she said. And she was. For the first time that evening, she felt so tired and overrun. "You look it," Dad said and hugged her. Dad always smelled good, smelling of Old Spice and Stetson cologne. She hugged him back. "Come on," he said. "Let's go to bed. We can work more with Amelia tomorrow. Hey, if you want, I can fix a bag of popcorn and some chocolate milk. We can watch a scary movie, just like in the old days, or a racing movie, your pick." "Why not both?" she asked, knowing she'd fall asleep before they'd even finish the first one. Dad agreed. They went in, sat in the living room, and had snacks. The first movie they watched was Christine. Tommie was surprisingly able to make it through that one. But they were only about a quarter of the way through Days of Thunder, her dad's all-time favorite movie, when she finally drifted off. As she slept, she dreamed of Jerry. But he wasn't a ghost in those dreams. No, he was alive and well, a guest at their house. He was there to relay a message to her, but before he could ever say what the message contained, he either started speaking gibberish or the dream would start over. They felt endless, different each time in small ways, but still largely the same. She felt like she was living in Groundhog Day, which was pure, unfiltered torment. Chapter 30. Tommie never received an email from Groovy Hollow Holdings Incorporated, so when the day of the race came, she and her dad loaded up and headed to the track anyway. She might not have been invited to the party like Carol, but she was going anyway, crashing it. Nerves unsettled her stomach as she hopped into her dad's truck. She texted Carol and asked her if she needed a ride. Mom was driving separately and had offered to pick up her elderly friend if needed. Carol texted back saying that she didn't. Harold, her nephew, had graciously agreed to take her. So with that, they backed out of the driveway and headed towards Groovy Hollow. They arrived at the facility within 5 minutes of their departure. It hardly seemed long enough. Tommie looked into the right side view mirror. She could see Amelia strapped down to the trailer behind. Her sickness of anxiety abided. They pulled up at the registration booth. Both Tommie and her dad hopped out as Mom waited patiently from behind. "Is this where we sign in?" Dad asked as the two of them approached the woman at the table. She was wearing an orange vest over a blue shirt. The Groovy Hollow Raceway logo was stamped over her heart. She was an older woman, not quite elderly, but not a spring chicken anymore either. And yet her skin seemed to pop. It was full of rosy color, full of light and nearly free of wrinkles. A thick layer of ruby red lipstick was smeared on her lips. She looked up from the papers she was shuffling. Her eyes sparkled blue. She noticed them, perhaps for the first time, and smiled wide enough to show off all her teeth. They were clean, straight, and pearly white. Tommie could see the fog of whatever alternative world she was lost in leaving her gaze. "Hi, can I help you?" she asked. Her voice was smooth and kind, warm and inviting. "Yeah, do we check in here for the event?" Tommie nudged behind her at Amelia, resting on the trailer beneath a rather unflattering gray sheet. Wait until they see the paint scheme, though, Tommie thought, beaming with pride. Her gray ghost was absolutely drop-dead gorgeous. "Oh, you're a driver," she said. She looked down at the messy stack of papers in front of her. "Yes, ma'am, you can check in right here. I just need your name so I can pull up your application on file." "Tommie Jo Swanson?" Tommie said. She spoke the words carefully and clearly. That was when it really hit her that they were there and doing this for real. Before, racing in the Groovy Hollow 300 was a distant dream that was hardly a reality, no matter how determined she was. Though she truly did believe that someday she would arrive at the track as a competitor and test her skills against some of the best racers in the world. It had always seemed distant for her. Not really out of reach, but way off to where it could only be grazed by her fingertips. Now, though, she turned to face the track, considering Amelia behind her. She saw the size of the grandstands and the infrastructure of the concrete walls outside, and she could imagine the asphalt track inside. It was real. It was happening. Within the next hour or two, she would be turning her first laps on the infamous track and seeing how much she needed to adjust the car prior to qualifying. The woman continued to thumb through files on her laptop as well as the loose sheets of paper covered in black markings in front of her. Her smile faltered before becoming a frown. "I'm sorry, I don't see anyone here by that name. Could you have registered by a different name, perhaps?" "No, I put my name, I'm sure of that," Tommie said, feeling defensive. She felt for the first time the threat of having it all crash down around her. Her hopes and dreams, her entire purpose. It started to make her sick to her stomach. She turned over her shoulder and considered the porta-john over there. Her tummy rumbled angrily. "Could you check again?" Tommie didn't want to sound rude. The woman didn't deserve such backlash, but at the same time, she was so close to living out her dream. And to have it snatched away from her when she was so close, she couldn't abide by that. And anyone standing in her way was bound to take the brunt of her anger and disappointment, right or wrong. It was an unfortunate casualty, but a necessary one nonetheless. She had come this far. The last thing she wanted to hear was, "You're not allowed." The woman took a second email. After apparently still not finding Tommie's registration form, she looked up uncomfortably and checked a third time. She shook her head. Nothing. Tommie's nightmares, the ultimate disappointment, seemed more real and obtainable now. That was crushing. Devastating. "Nope, I'm sorry," the woman shifted. "Do you remember how you filled out your application? Was it on the website? Because sometimes it can get a little buggy." "It was through email," Tommie answered. The woman's eyebrows raised. "Oh, you're an invited guest." The smile returned to her face. She blinked 3 times. Tommie shrugged. "Well, not really. I struck up a friendship with this woman who raced here last year." Tommie's stomach made a noise again. She clutched it to soothe it, to calm its protests. It didn't work. "Carol Oates, she—" "Oh, yes, the woman who had that accident. I hated to see that. An unfortunate reality of this kind of sport, though." Tommie went on. She didn't want to think about the risks of racing, and it was sort of cruel for this woman, this stranger, to bring that up, especially in front of her dad. Carol got an email inviting her to return. She said no, that she was done with racing, retired. But she encouraged me to apply through her email, and I did. "I see." The woman fell silent a moment. She went back to focus on her computer. "Well, I'm not seeing any Tommie Jo Swanson listed here." Those were the exact words Tommie didn't want to hear. She had failed. She had failed already, and she hadn't even gotten to turn a single lap. Talk about the cruelest of blows. Then the woman snapped her attention back to her. "But there might be something I can do." She turned and fetched an old-timey paper application and a wooden No. 2 pencil. She clipped the application to the clipboard along with the pencil and handed it over to Tommie. "Our website has been somewhat glitchy over the past year or so. Every now and again, there are some applicants that, let's just say, fall through the cracks at no fault of their own. When that happens, to appease angry and frustrated competitors, the brass allows them to file a paper application to go under immediate review. And though your situation isn't exactly that, I think it's close enough. Within the same ballpark, for sure." The woman winked at Tommie and her father. Maybe everything was going to work out after all. Dad thanked the woman, and the two returned to the truck. A different woman with glowing orange sticks and a reflective yellow vest motioned for them to pull forward. And they did, setting up camp in a field near the backstretch gate. Tommie quickly filled out her application, double-checking everything through at once, and turned it back into the woman at the information booth. The woman said she'd get it to the right people and that it was just a waiting game from there. It took about an hour and 15 minutes for Tommie to get a call. She almost didn't feel the buzzing of her vibrating phone against her thigh. Missing the call because she left her phone on vibrate would have been a blunder to end all blunders. The caller ID didn't outright recognize the number, but it had a business area code, and Tommie answered it quickly, nearly dropping the phone. "Hello? Hello?" She could hear the eagerness in her own voice, which embarrassed her slightly. Still, she didn't feel the need to put forth the effort to mask it. "Good morning. Is this, Tommie Jo Swanson?" The man's voice on the other end was smooth and had a charming southern drawl. He sounded a little bit like Sawyer from Lost. She always had a crush on him and his smooth-talking ways. It was a cliché, she knew, kind of like how so many women were infatuated with Matthew McConaughey. Yes, sir," she said eagerly. "Well, hi there, Miss Swanson. This is Joel Tapper. I'm the admissions coordinator for the Groovy Hollow 300 this year, and we've just received your application." "Uh-huh," Tapper continued. "Well, we're pleased to offer you a spot on the entry list for this year's race." Tommie wanted to scream in excitement. "But before we get into the nitty and gritty of it all, I must inform you that we have quite a stacked field this year. Including you, 68 drivers have filed to compete this year. All 68 will qualify at 1 p.m. today for one of the 39 spots. As you know, the defending winner gets an automatic provisional and will start the race in the 40th position. So that means there are 68 drivers for 39 spots. That means that 29 of those drivers will not make the main event. That's an unfortunate reality of auto racing, particularly at the grassroots level. I just wanted to touch base and make sure you understand that you have no guaranteed spot in tonight's race." "I understand," Tommie said. She was silent for a moment, but her mind was running a million miles a minute. Going in, she knew that she would have to qualify her way into the show. She also knew that Bucky Blackwell and his Halloween machine were going to make the field regardless. But speaking to the man, the pressure started to mount. The crisp October air seemed hotter, and her clothes felt as if they were choking her. "Perfect. Now, as you know, the first practice this year starts at 11 o'clock a.m. You'll need to go back to the credentials booth to get your driver pass and 2 VIP passes that'll go to any one of your choosing. In the infield, smoking or alcohol is not permitted. If you are caught with it, any time you turn on the track will be disallowed, and your entry will be automatically withdrawn. Do you understand?" "Yes," she said. "Great. As I said, the first practice is at 11 a.m. It'll last until about 11:45, and there'll be a 15-minute break. Happy hour begins at 12 noon and will last until 12:55. Coverage for qualifying is slated at 1, with the first car scheduled to roll at 1:05. You can enter the track whenever there's no activity on the track. There's no tunnel, so once you're in the facility, you'll be there until the completion of qualifying or the race tonight. However, if there is an on-track incident between yourself and another driver, and you escalate the tensions either during or after the conclusion of the race, you will be called to our officials booth and dished out a punishment that can be anything from a monetary fine to suspension from further events at the track. And the suspensions can be indefinite in nature if the officials feel that that's the best course of action to take." "Sure thing. Got it. Awesome. Head over to the credentials booth and check in, then you can head on to the track. There will be one inspection held after qualifying. After your qualifying attempt, your car will be impounded. If you do happen to make the race, but your car is found to be illegal, your time will be disallowed automatically, and you will be disqualified. Good luck today, we'll be rooting for you. The call ended. It was a lot of information for Tommie to take in, and the matter-of-fact way in which the man spoke did little to ease her budding dread and frenzied nerves. Dad flashed her a puzzled glance. Who was that? Some guy over the competition, Tommie answered. She was already blanking on his name. Oh, are we in? We're in. Tommie thought she ought to smile, and she tried, but she knew that it came off as paper-thin and insincere. Dad noticed it, too. Are you okay? Yeah. Hang tight here. I'm going to go to the credentials booth to check in. She did and returned a few minutes later with a driver's ID dangling from a lanyard around her neck and 2 other VIP passes on matching lanyards. She handed one over to her dad. She turned to look at her mama. Mama, they'd only let me have 2. Mama put up a hand. Give it to Carol, sweetie, she said without a stutter. What about you? Tommie asked. Meanwhile, Dad fought with his lanyard to stay tucked beneath his collar of his polo shirt. Tommie couldn't help but laugh. I'll buy a ticket and watch from the stands, no biggie. Carol and your dad should really be the ones down there working with you. I can cheer you on just as loudly from the grandstands. Tommie smiled and tears stung her eyes. She gave her mother a big hug. I love you, Mama. We'll see you soon. Mama kissed her forehead. I love you too, sweetie. Just be careful. I will, Tommie promised. And just like that, they uncovered and unloaded Amelia. She and her father headed into the track through the gate on the backstretch. Chapter 31. Amelia sat on pit road, parked diagonally into a pit stall. They pitched a tent behind the pit wall to provide them with a little shade. Dad worked under the hood for about an hour, just giving things another look before closing and latching it. By the time his own inspection was finished, it was time for the opening practice to begin. Tommie was the first driver out on the track. She turned the first handful of laps by herself, just getting a general feel for things. On those initial set of tires, the car was wicked loose. She nearly lost it a couple of times and thought back to her dream. Man, she was thankful for those walls being installed in the corners, rather than there just being a downward-sloping sand dune running off into the woods. She did her best to shake the dream away from her, and it went, but not before bringing with it the image of Jerry Slater's moonlit face peering out from her cracked bedroom closet door. Tommie let off the gas and brought Amelia down pit road. She slammed on the brakes when she almost missed her pit stall, skidding the tires and screeching to a halt. There were a handful of drivers turning laps now. In her rear view, she could see the roofs of their cars zoom by, but couldn't make out any of the colors of the paint schemes. They looked more like white and black smears than anything else. Tommie undid her belts, took off her helmet, and climbed out. Dad was there to give her a headset, and she clapped it over her ears. How'd that feel? Dad asked. Loose. It's real slippery out there. I saw. He took a moment to glance up at the scoring pylon in the center of the track. Tommie followed his gaze. She was 6 now out of 6 cars, fixing to be 7, who turned laps in this opening practice session. 6, she said, confirming her disappointment. Yeah, we're a little slow, but don't worry about that right now. We'll find speed. First, we have to make you a little more comfortable in the car. When you can drive it and handle it a little better, we'll turn faster laps. Tommie, unsure of herself, nodded. Okay, she said, and put on a pair of thick mirrored sunglasses. Maybe then nobody could see the hurt stinging her eyes. She crossed the pit wall as more cars took to the track. She grabbed her phone and went through her messages. She got one message from Carol stating that she was there. Tommie texted back, practice now, be out to meet you in about 20 or 30 minutes. Carol responded with a thumbs-up emoji, followed by a gif of roaring applause from a well-dressed crowd in a theater. The caption at the bottom of the gif read, Congratulations! Tommie rolled her eyes and set her phone down. What has she gotten herself into by pushing Carol into the fast-moving world of technology? She walked back over to the car, repositioning her headset. Before saying anything to her father, she looked back at the scoring pylon. 24 cars had now made laps. She sat 20th of the 24. At least she, in those very shaky opening laps, was faster than a handful of others. She also glanced at the top of the pylon to see who was fast. The usual suspects were Smith and Power, the duo, leading the way. But Tommie had the nagging feeling that there was a large gap between third and fourth. But it won't be them leading the way on the final lap, Tommie thought grimly. Her mind went to the mythic Halloween machine and the stranglehold on the competition Bucky Blackwell and his bad car had at Groovy Hollow. Even more dread pooled inside her. Dad turned to look at her, his mouth open as if to say something, but it all got washed away. A look of concern replaced his glee. He was having fun. Regardless of the results in the qualifying and practice, he was having fun. It would have been no big deal if they hadn't made the race to Dad. They'd simply pack things up and try again next year. Tommie was happy for him and his optimism. The last thing she wanted was to snatch it away from him, but to Tommie, this was make or break. There may not be a next year if she doesn't perform well here this weekend. Dad saw that worry and potential heartbreak on her face. He put a gentle hand on her shoulder like a good dad ought to and flashed her his goofy, encouraging smile. The kind fathers give to their youngins when they tell them that they can truly grow up and be anything they want to be. At that very moment, they really believe that they can. They see all the potential in the world for what it truly is. "It's going to be all right, Tommie," he said. "I've made some adjustments to snug the car up some on entry. We've got this. I want you to go back out and run maybe 20 laps. We'll see if you can improve. I bet you will. Then it'll just be about fine-tuning, okay?" Tommie nodded her agreement. She took off the headset and eagerly climbed back into the car. Dad fastened her window net and she pulled off pit road. She didn't know exactly what her dad did to the car, but it did behave much better in the corners. That was to say that it didn't constantly feel as though it was going to slip out from under her at any given time. She could feel Amelia under her, building her confidence. The first lap she felt was slow, but she was just feeling things out. She didn't need Dad to chime over the radio and tell her that she was under speed, but he didn't. He put his whole confidence in her and said that she would get it when she was ready, and she did. She increased speeds lap by lap, pushing the car as far as it was willing to go. She searched for the best line. She ran 5 laps up the wall in the corners and then tried the inside. There was no denying that there was more speed and more momentum on the outside. But the inside line was the quickest way around, or so she felt. As her 40-lap run progressed, she felt how the car changed on the tires. The tires were harder than she expected, meaning that they didn't wear as easily. But as she got to the end of her run, she felt the car slipping back into its former instability. That was when she knew it was time to return to the pits. Shortly after, she took the hard left and fed down pit road. The red and black flags came out, indicating that the session was over. Tommie brought Amelia to a halt in the stall, and Dad started to check over the tires immediately. She undid her belts and took off her helmet, climbing out. Was that any better? It was. She knew it was. Felt it and knew it had to be. Dad rubbed the tires and nodded. "Yeah, a little better. How'd the car feel?" Tommie looked up at the scoring pylon. She ended the practice in the 56th position. Nowhere near good enough to make the race. "It felt a lot better, but we're still way off, aren't we?" Dad, with a puckered bottom lip, considered his practice sheet. He wrote some things down and erased some others. "We're not as far as you think. Come here." Tommie went there and looked at the practice times. Among the 10-lap averages, you were in the top 40, 28 to be exact. So I know that we have the speed over the longer runs. I felt more confident on the shorter run, though. Dad nodded. Yeah, comfortability's important. If the driver ain't comfortable, the driver ain't going fast. So I wanted to fix that first. Glad you felt a difference. In terms of speed, we're all right there together, so next practice, I'm going to work on setups that will give the car a little more oomph. I'd like to get the car accelerating a little better off the corner. Entry's fine, or so I gather, but we've got another practice to get through. I'll get to work. You go out and get Carol before they close the gates again. Tommie nodded, and she walked away from Amelia and Dad. With each step, her heart sank a little farther in her chest. It burned inside her. There was no way she was going to make this race. Absolutely no way.
Thanks for listening, Groovy Gang. We'll be back with more Legend of Groovy Hollow in a moment. All right, folks, we're back. Let's return to the Legend of Groovy Hollow.
Chapter 32. Outside, Carol and Mama were talking. Tommie approached them, doing her best not to cry. Carol looked good. Real good, especially after being cooped up in that blasted hospital for so long. She was dressed in comfortable mom jeans and a pink polo shirt with a pink ribbon embroidered on the left breast. Carol was a cancer survivor after all. Not only did she beat up on competitors on the track, but she also beat cancer's butt that was truly wicked. Carol saw her coming and rushed to her. A little surprised, Tommie flinched as the old woman hugged her. She was getting around all right, that was for certain, and Tommie was so happy for her. It was like watching a kid truly in their element. This track, Groovy Hollow, was her ancestral home. A home where Bucky Blackwell set up camp as an unwanted guest. Tommie felt that Carol believed that she was the one to dethrone him once and for all. Tommie felt that pressure and the heat inside her, and her anxiety intensified. After a few seconds, Tommie returned her friend's hug. "I'm so proud of you, Tommie," Carol whispered in her ear. "Yeah, well, thanks for coming, Carol. I promise I'll try and make you proud." Tommie took a hand away from Carol and motioned Mama forward. Reluctantly, Mama joined the group hug. Carol gave her a final big squeeze and then let go. She stood back. She was wearing a big smile, and her face was radiant and lively. "I take it you've already done your first laps. Did it feel good?" "Yes," Tommie said, and it did. Despite not being as fast as she wished, it felt good being back behind the wheel. She considers that she ought to keep that frame of mind going forward. No matter how the day turned out, the fact that she was fast and by no means the slowest car out there, she had a little something to feel good about. If she didn't make the race, there was always next year, or the year after that, and so on. Deep inside, she still knew that this was her one shot, and it was best not to squander it. Off in the distance, buried by sounds, came the muffled thunder of the PA system. Tommie turned to Carol. "I guess we should probably go," she said. She took Carol by the hand, and on they went. Mama waved her goodbyes behind them and started for the ticket booth. Once inside and down in the garage area, Carol took an instant liking to Amelia. She ran a wrinkled hand along the left front fender and even got a good look inside. Tommie could see the tears pooling in her eyes. "You miss it?" she asked. "Yeah, a lot more than I thought I would," Carol admitted. She paused for a moment and looked up. Wiping away a single tear, she smiled. "But my time has passed. It's your time now. Make the most of it, won't you?" Tommie told her that of course she would. She had not come all this way to halfway do anything. For her, it was all or nothing. "I really like this scheme, Tommie. Gray Ghost, right?" "It is one of my all-time favorites. Dale Jr. drove it twice, and it was—" "Buddy Baker, I remember," Carol said. Of course she did. Carol Oates was more than just a hobby racer. She was a student of the sport. It's an appropriate scheme for this race, it being near Halloween and all. She and Tommie exchanged a look, and Tommie got the reference. She was thinking of Bucky Blackwell and his infamous Halloween machine. Tommie wondered if it was there yet, or if he just showed up right before the race was about to start, like a hard-partying rock star stumbling onto the stage after the band had already started playing. Time ticked down, and it was time for happy hour. Tommie slipped into Amelia and fired the engine. She backed out of the stall and drove slowly down to the end of pit road. Like the last practice, she wanted to get the first crack at the now rubbered-up track. The mission this time was to just run a quick qualifying lap as fast as she could on fresh tires. She did as she was told. The car was noticeably different in the way it felt. The car jarred hard as she went down into the first corner and hit that first bump. The impact was so hard, in fact, that she felt like Amelia lifted off into the air for just a split second before slamming back down on the track. The wheel almost tugged free from her tightly gripped hands. She washed up the track on the backstretch and threw the car into turns 3 and 4. She repeated this for another lap before shutting off her engine and feeding down onto pit road. She came to rest in her stall and immediately started unbuckling to climb out. Dad came on the radio. Hang on. We're going to make another run. I just want to wait a few minutes." "What the heck did you do to this thing?" Tommie asked. "I just made a few adjustments. Unfortunately, due to impound procedures, we'll have to start the race on this setup. Later on, we can make adjustments and make the car a little more comfortable for you. But if it was speed you were concerned about, I don't think you have much to worry about anymore. That was a fast lap." "Really? On my end, it was like riding a bull. I was just hanging on for dear life." "Oh yeah, really," Dad said with a laugh. Tommie watched him through the windshield as he and Carol considered the stopwatch in the practice sheet from the last practice. It was all smiles in the number 28 pit at that moment, and Tommie thought with a new sense of earned confidence that she had got this. She did, after all, belong. They waited on pit lane for about 15 minutes. Cars zoomed around on the track, making qualifying attempts of their own. Once Dad saw a break in the action, he said, "All right, kid. You ready to give it another go?" 10-4, Tommie said, to sound as official and professional as possible. Then she backed out of her stall and waited at the end of pit road for an additional couple of minutes. Then it was time to make another run, and that she did. Her second run felt a little better than the first, probably because she knew more about what to expect from the car. That wasn't to say that there weren't wrenches thrown here and there. Amelia was behaving wildly on the dips and bumps of the racing surface, which seemed to age at an accelerated rate. After 2 laps, she returned to pit road, allowing the car to cool before making a final attempt. Dad changed the tires and put fresh ones on, and Tommie went out, making her final run. When the red and black flags were displayed on the tail end of that final run, Tommie brought the car back down the pit road and climbed out. Nervously, she walked over to her dad and Carol, ignoring the scoring pylon, eager to find out how she ran from them. Dad sometimes sugarcoats things. Carol, though, was who Tommie expected to be a straight shooter because she was a racer herself. There's no benefit in sugarcoating, not if she wanted to get better. It was best to tackle reality and her own shortcomings head first. "So, where are we at?" she asked earnestly. Dad and Carol exchanged a look she didn't quite care for. "We're close," Dad said. "Super close." That was when Tommie glanced up at the scoring pylon. She wasn't in the top 10, not that she expected to be. She had no delusions. She watched the bottom of the pylon. Not 11th or 12th, not 13th nor 14th. She wasn't even 39th or 40th or 41st or 42nd. It wasn't until 43rd came across the screen that she saw her number 28 flashing next to it. Darn. Chapter 33. The booming announcement that all drivers are to report to the media center came over the loudspeakers shortly after qualifying. Tommie hardly had a chance to look at the practice timesheet before the announcement was made. She looked at her dad questioningly. "Drivers' meeting," Carol said. "And you'll probably draw numbers for the qualifying order." Tommie nodded. "Okay, guess I'll be back," she said. In her mind, she would only be in there, an hour? That sounded right. She gave both her father and Carol a hug and headed straight for the media center located on the south end of the infield. The room was packed and overly warm with all the bodies in there. Tommie felt short of breath and her nerves heightened. She wanted to leave. She wanted to leave bad. The man who stood atop the stage at the podium was a fellow she didn't recognize. He cleared his throat and the soft rumble of voices in the crowd tapered off. He introduced himself as Hyde Wheeler, the chief race runner for the Groovy Hollow 300 this year. He made short business of thanking them, saying things like, "This event would never be possible if it wasn't for each and every one of you and your interest in racing here today." It was true, Tommie figured, but it was also true that this race would never be possible without the annual appearance of a certain phantom driver who drives a spooky Halloween-sponsored number 31 Chevrolet. It was a sad thought, but Tommie guessed that if it wasn't for Bucky Blackwell and all the mystery and legend surrounding his larger-than-life status in the sport, this event as a grassroots race would have dried up and died after the first year. To give them a little more credit, maybe they would have made it to the second year. Maybe, but Bucky was the draw. Tommie knew that, and little effort was made to conceal that basic fact. His name and the likeness of his car were plastered all over the Groovy Hollow website, along with a likely embellished story as his bio. His name and the Halloween machine were both branded all over the tickets. And each and every year it was, "Can anyone take down the gruesome and ruthless Bucky Blackwell at the historic Groovy Hollow Raceway?" He was the show, and Tommie got the sense that the rest of them were just field fillers. I'll keep this brief because I know it's hot in here, the AC's out, and there are a lot of bodies. So I promise to just go through the main points and get us all out of here. I know that we'd all rather be on the track anyway, and qualifying is looming. Mr. Hydewheeler ended his spiel of gratitude and got down to business. He went over the basic rules. In qualifying, drivers got 2 laps. The fastest lap would be the one that counted, and only the top 39 would make the race, yada yada. It was pretty straightforward. When it came to the race, the length would be 300 laps around the historic 0.74-mile Groovy Hollow Raceway. No stages, not like NASCAR. It was a complete throwback in that sense. Drivers were allowed 4 fresh sets of sticker tires in their pits, but had to start the race with the setup and a set of tires they used during qualifying, as the cars will be impounded and inspected towards the race. If anything illegal is found in the car during inspection, that driver would be disqualified immediately, and the driver with the 40th fastest time would be bumped up and into the field. That made Tommie feel a little better, and she breathed a sigh of relief. What were the odds that all the cars that attempted a qualifying run were legal anyhow? It was slim, but not impossible, and Tommie cautioned herself not to put all of her eggs in the basket of someone else's screw-up. When Mr. Hydewheeler was finished going over all the rules and regulations for the day, he dismissed them but urged them to stick around in the tent outside for the drawing. If a driver didn't stick around to draw for a qualifying spot, they would lose their opportunity to do so, and effectively be disqualified from the race. Tommie was the first one out of the building, and the fresh air was there to greet her as she spilled out. The air inside had grown so stale and hot. It was so hot outside. The infield of any track always seems to be the warmest place on Earth. But a slight welcoming breeze carried the air across her face and through her braided hair, drying up some of her sweat. The drivers drew in numerical order. Tommie patiently waited until they finally got to number 28. She walked up to the large pine box, which contained folded index cards with printed numbers on them. She unfolded hers. The number 49 was printed in big, bolded numbers. She showed Mr. Hyde and then turned to show the rest of the drivers as if she were a game show valet. "The 48th qualifier, Miss Tommie Jo Swanson," Mr. Hyde yelled into a microphone somewhat obnoxiously. There was a small clatter of claps. Unfortunately, Tommie Jo refolded the number and held it crumpled up in her hand. The 49th to qualify, she thought to herself. I'm good with that. In her mind, it was best to qualify later rather than earlier. At least if you're one of the later drivers to turn a lap, you know just about where you stand as soon as you get out of the car. The most agonizing part of the qualifying session once it started was the long wait. 49th in line did little favors for Tommie's anxiety. She somehow both dreaded and needed to be in the car all at once, as if her brain was split into the devils and angels clinging to each shoulder. Only one of the junkyard jacks from 2 years ago returned. It was Ernest, and he flashed Tommie a disgusted sneer as he climbed into his neon pink number 63 throwback and set out to qualify. He was the first of the bunch and stayed at the top of the board until being dethroned by Brandon Power, driving a number 44 out of the Groove-sponsored car. Slowly, Tommie and her number 28 unsponsored Grey Ghost crawled up to the grid. She thought that maybe if she were in the car and behind the wheel, she'd be able to better manage the complex feelings she was feeling in the several moments leading up to her eventual qualifying attempt. But she never could know for sure. Maybe all the butterflies and doubts haunting her mind were normal when it came to driving. She looked over at Carol and started to ask her, but quickly shut her mouth and dropped the thought like a hot pan. It was ridiculous, after all, that any legend of Carol's stature could ever feel nerves from behind the wheel. It was unfathomable to her. As they waited, Tommie glanced over her shoulder at the car a number of times, feeling that something was amiss with it, that something wasn't right. It was a bad, sinking feeling that she couldn't quite verbalize to describe and wasn't so sure she wanted to. It's the nerves, she warned herself, just the nerves. And the reassurance made her feel a little bit better, but she didn't go far enough to put her at 100% ease. As strange as it might have seemed, she felt like someone was sitting in her car. From the blurred corners of her vision, yes, she could almost make out a darkened shape of a person sitting there in the driver's seat, both hands on the wheel at 9 and 3. But the apparition was gone whenever she turned to face the car properly. Just the nerves, she told herself again, saying that she was being foolish. But it didn't help this time because on some level she knew she wasn't. She thought of the closet and saw the dead blue face of Jerry Slater staring out at her from within its darkened confines, and her heart started to beat faster. Only 3 cars in front of her now. Then there were 2. It was time to get in the car and strap in for the make-or-break 2 laps of her life. The car positioned 2 cars in front of her was Chad Duncan. His time was fast, yes, and he shot straight up to the top of the board, but to Tommie, his run seemed to all happen within the blink of an eye. She had hardly gotten her own gloves on when he was heading back down to pit road, and the car in front of her was rolling off. Crap, it's now or never, she thought, and fired the engine. In her number 15 Ford, Shelley Dawson qualified in front of Tommie, and her run also seemed to be over in remarkable time. There was no hiding now, all or nothing, Tommie told herself and started rolling out onto the track. Tommie wasted little time getting up to speed, careful not to spin her tires. She fumbled through the gears and was at top speed by the time she entered the 3rd turn. She took the green flag and the car plowed into the first corner. She ran through that jarring bump on the inside and the car almost came out from under her. "Hang with me, Amelia," Tommie said, gripping the steering wheel tighter. Throughout her run, she felt as if the car was everywhere all at once, as though it wouldn't stick to one line. She ran a little higher in turns 1 and 2 in her second lap, which avoided some of those brutal bumps on the inside, but she was sure it brushed off some speed. As she crossed the line to take the checkered flag, she immediately reached forward and shut her engine off. She got the strangest sensation once again that she was not alone. With the Hans device, it was hard to crane her neck to look over at the passenger side of the car. But she looked over, straining her eyes, and could have sworn she saw the same darkened shape clinging to the roll bars for dear life. That was ridiculous, she assured herself, and did her best to block out such outrageous nonsense. By the time her run was done, she was eager to get back to the pits. She felt overly hot and her throat tightened. She thought she might get sick, and the last thing in the world she wanted to do was spew right there in the heated dome that was Amelia. She followed the directions of the official monitoring her toward the garage area. She called her dad on the radio. "How was that?" she asked, and she waited a moment for a response. None ever came. "Dad? Carol?" Nothing but bitter silence. That couldn't be good. Her mind went to 2 separate places at that moment. Either something was wrong with the radio, which was bad, but not disastrous, as it would be the best-case scenario, or there was news, and it was bad. She felt already, without even knowing the results, that she had failed. She parked Amelia and eagerly got out of the car. As she slipped through the window and down to the track, she felt an odd sense of loss, as if the car and herself, for a single moment in time, had become one and were acting in tandem with one another, as if she was as worthless without the car as the car was without its driver. She walked over to Dad and Carol, who stared down at a datasheet, their faces perplexed. "What's the matter?" she asked, but of course she knew what the matter was. She was slow. So slow, in fact, that she wasn't even in the top 39 after that run. Instantly, she was already out, never even getting the thrill and horror of being put on that bubble. She was out of the show from the start. She just knew it. Dad kept his attention on the data page, ignoring her. It was unlike him to do such a thing unless something was very, very wrong. Carol broke away from the data sheet and looked at Tommie. Her frown turned upside down into the widest grin Tommie had ever seen. "I think you're gonna make it, dear," she said. At first, Carol's reassurance didn't quite register. "Make what?" she asked herself stupidly. The answer was so obvious that if it were a snake, it would have reached out and bit her, and no protests would have come from her end. It took her an embarrassingly long time for her wires to connect where she could realize what Carol was essentially saying. Her lap time was good. Darn good. Tommie pushed past Carol and reached for the data sheet. "Almost an entire second better," Dad said proudly. But Tommie wanted to see it for herself. During practice, her lap time around the track stalled at 24:88. She had improved in her qualifying run to 23:92. Though the difference between the two numbers was small, in racing it would prove to make up all the time in the world. She glanced up at the scoring pylon. She wasn't in the top 10 or even the top 15, but she was just outside that threshold. With 20 cars left to qualify, Tommie Jo sat 19 on the board. Good enough to make the race, she thought. She waited for the remainder of the qualifying session, breathing more easily. Chapter 34. The race was set to kick off at 7:30 Eastern. Drivers were to report to the main stage positioned at the start-finish line by 6:15. The time between the conclusion of qualifying and the prefatory matters before the driver introductions for Tommie was spent outside tailgating with Dad, Mom, and Carol. It felt good to let loose some, but Tommie didn't want to let the reins out of her hand too far. There was still a race to go, after all, and not only did she want to run okay, she wanted to be a serious threat for the win, as improbable as that seemed. When qualifying was all said and done, Tommie was sitting 32nd on the board. With 2 disqualifications ahead of her, she would be rolling off tonight in row 15th in the 30th position. That's 10 positions ahead of Bucky Blackwell, she thought in the back of her mind. I wonder how long it'll take to see that Halloween machine in my rear-view mirror. But mostly in the moment, she did her best to put that out of her mind. She was intimidated, in truth, but thought it best not to show it. To her, Blackwell needed to be just another racer, another obstacle to overcome. Myths, legends, and superstitions be darned. She didn't want to eat too heavily of a dinner, so she opted to have a single hot dog with mustard and a small bag of Crowned King barbecue potato chips. To drink, she only had water compared to Carol's iced tea and her father's typical glass bottle of Mountain Dew. When they were almost done eating, Mom asked, "So, honey, are you excited for the race tonight?" She was, but she was also extremely nervous. For a moment that didn't last long enough, in her opinion. She had almost forgotten that a race was even taking place that night. Her mom, reminding her of it, though, cast a dark cloud over those good time feelings, darkening her weary head. Her nerves reminded her that they were very much so unsettled, and they threatened to get the best of her yet again. Rather than giving in to them, though, she had come too far to throw it all away and run now. She forced them deep down within her as far as they would go. She locked them away so they no longer screamed, but were rather little more than whispers in the static of her consciousness. It was time to get her game face on. When the clock struck 6:10, she hugged her mom, who wished her luck, and ushered Carol and Dad inside. Not long after that, driver introductions started. They skipped over Blackwell's entry, opting to announce him last as usual. Starting at 39, Tommie counted down along with the announcer, who sounded an awful lot like Steve Phelps himself. Now, it couldn't be, could it? Until he got down to the 31st starter. Tommie readied herself. Then the announcer said, "Starting in the 30th position, please welcome the driver of the number 128 Grey Ghost Chevrolet Commonwealth's own Tommie Jo Swanson." Tommie stepped through the curtain and onto the stage. She was surprised slightly by the clusters of flashing lights. She waved to the crowd and they went crazy. But they didn't know her from Eve, did they? Was this the hometown effect? Tommie didn't like to think so, but thought it was. Maybe she dreamed that it was, to be the most precise. She walked across the stage and down the steps onto the track. She didn't ride in the back of a pickup. They didn't have all those bells and whistles at Groovy Hollow. All that she had to do was get her head firmly in the game and head straight to her car, and that was exactly what she did. They announced Chad Duncan as the pole winner, and there was a modest amount of applause for him. Then the crowd and everyone in the industry down on pit road went bone-chillingly silent. All that could be heard from down in the infield was the buzzing of stadium lights, which circled around Groovy Hollow like a makeshift halo. They all waited in suspense. Off in the distance, they could hear the kickback of an engine exploding to life. It revved, showing off its fiery muscles. Then it started to approach. The deep growl grew louder as the car rolled nearer. Tommie craned her neck to look at the backstretch and get any sort of peek of the Halloween machine. But there were too many trailers blocking her view. She could hear it, though, when it turned onto the track and spilled into the turn. The sound of the engine became more concentrated then. From the overhead speakers, the announcer, who the constant rumble could barely hear of the number 31's engine, said, "And now, the star of our show, starting in the 40th position, driving the number 31 Halloween Machine Chevrolet, Bucky Blackwell." She saw the car then. He rolled to a stop a row behind her, its brakes squalling as it came to a rest. Even through the opening ceremonies, for which Tommie merely went through the motions, she couldn't take her eyes away from the Halloween machine. Seeing it this far up close, she realized that it wasn't just that the car's windshield was tinted. It may have very well been crystal clear, but beyond it was a thick black cloud of smoke. At first, she thought that something might have been wrong with the car, like there was an exhaust leak or something. But the air around the car remained clear and clean of toxic debris. Tommie leaned forward to get a better look at the open passenger side window for a sign. Any sign at all that the smoke was leaking out of the car. But the thick black mist remained contained as if trapped in a bubble. It was more than that, though. As she stared longer at the mass, it looked less like smoke and more like a cloud. It was turning, rotating all ways at once. Like a heartbeat, heat lightning flashed amid the black, and she thought for a single second that she saw something moving within the thick, suffocating atmosphere. A pair of squirming and writhing tendrils that were restless. Through squinted eyes, Tommie tried to make out the shape of Bucky sitting behind the steering wheel, but couldn't. All she could see was charred black hands with bone showing through the peeling skin gripping the steering wheel, ready to go. Fireworks in the mountains punctuated the national anthem. It was now or never. Time to go racing. Tommie hugged her dad and Carol, never once taking an eye away from Bucky's car, before slipping into Amelia and pulling her belts tight. She put her helmet on, and Dad tested the radio. She told him it sounded all good on her end as Carol fastened the window net and offered her a good luck fist bump. Then came the time the fans and drivers had all been waiting for. Tommie didn't know who was giving the command this year, and she didn't ask. Inside the car, they couldn't hear it anyway. After the command was given, Dad said, "Fire up!" Tommie hit the ignition button. Emily growled eagerly to life. They spent a few minutes letting her engine purr, resting on pit road. Tommie and Dad took advantage of that time to check all switches, dot all the I's, and cross all the T's. When they started rolling onto the track, Dad reminded her to be mindful of her brakes. It was a long race by late model stock standards, and he didn't want them to overheat. Tommie said 10-4, and he reminded her that the jarring qualifying setup was still in the car. He said that the first handful of laps until the competition caution on lap 25 was going to be a handful. He told her to just develop a pace in those opening laps and play it conservatively. She repeated, 10-4. After a few laps out on the track, the pace car brought the field down pit road. Tommie's pit was in stall number 15, and as she passed, she put a hand out the window and saluted her team. Many of Dad's hires were from Jerry Slater's old team. They were a little weird, quiet, so to speak, but a relatively nice group of guys, by Tommie's estimation, despite their zombified demeanor. They lined up to take the green flag. As the lights went out in the pace car out front, Tommie glanced into her rear-view mirror. The Halloween machine was lurking ominously behind her. She still couldn't see through the windshield. She didn't like that, and a lump arose in her throat. But there was no time for panic now. They slowly came around the third turn, and the pace car dipped down on pit road. The fans in the stands stood, and it looked like a series of waves rising in upset, stormy water. The flagman put a hand up, a gesture that seemed to say, "Easy, easy," before he waved the green flag. The engines of the collective field raged to life. Tommie stomped down on the gas. She felt the tires spinning but not gaining traction. Bucky Blackwell's Halloween machine slammed into the back of her. She chased her out-of-control car up the track, and Bucky slipped down on the inside. For a moment, Tommie was sure she was heading straight for the wall without having even completed a single lap. But strangely, something caught the car. It all happened so fast. It usually does in racing. For a split second, it felt as if everything was getting away from her. Even what was right in front of her face was blurred and rushed. But at that moment, when everything seemed doomed, she saw 3 hands on the wheel. Her own 2 were sitting at 11 and 5, trying to wrestle with Amelia to keep her out of the wall. The other one wasn't hers at all. It was a big baseball mitt of a hand with its long bony fingers gripping the wheel at 12 noon and giving a slight tug to the left. The car fell back on the track then, and the hand disappeared once the rest of her senses caught up with her. She looked over to her right but could see nothing. But she felt that she was not alone in the car, and whatever phantom was riding with her just saved her race. Tommie got into some sort of a groove in the first 25 laps leading up to the competition caution. The car was far from comfortable. Every bump seemed jarring and upsetting. Every corner felt as if her rear end was about to come out from under her, and she was going to wipe out into the wall. But she clamped it down in the corners, forcing it beneath her, until she saw the sweet graces of a caution flag flying from the flag stand. "How's it holding up in there, kiddo?" Dad asked as he came over the radio. Tommie's initial response was to tell her father that she needed to get out of the car and that she wasn't alone. She strained her eyes, trying to glimpse the passenger end of the roll cage, and she could see something there. But what, she couldn't make out. It was like making sense only of a bolded outline of a figure without being able to fill in what existed in the middle, if anything did exist in the middle at all. She shoved those concerns deep inside her. Even though she felt as though she wasn't alone, she felt no menace or malice from the spirit riding the shotgun in her car, so she let it go. The presence was responsible for saving her from wrecking after all. She came over the radio and told her dad, "Terribly, it's awful to drive. I need adjustments. I need to be a little snugger in the corners. 10-4, bring her down next time around. We'll change tires and try setting it up closer to that first practice." Tommie thought a moment. In her rear view, she saw only one car. "Dad, am I 38th? 10-4, but don't worry, we'll fix you up." There was another nagging thought on her mind that she just had to ask. "How far away was the leader from putting us a lap down?" There was a silence for a moment as Dad seemingly thought the question over. "I don't know, maybe a straightaway, but don't you—" Carol interrupted. "Don't worry about that, Tommie. Drive out of your windshield, not your rear view mirror. Driving out of the rear view will only encourage mistakes." "I couldn't agree more," Dad said. Tommie said 10-4, and when she got the chance, she brought her number 28 Grey Ghost down the agonizingly long pit road to stall number 15. She was careful when pulling in, and the crew started servicing the car. For a group of alleged zombies, they were quick to act. They changed all 4 tires, gassed it up, and made the appropriate adjustments. She was the last car to come off of pit road, but that was okay. She had a little more confidence now, assuming that Dad really did fix the car and put it back to how they had it near the end of the opening practice. The field was on split strategy. Most cars, even most of the leaders, came down pit road for some fresh Hoosier rubber. But there were a handful of cars. Tommie didn't know the exact number, didn't ask. She was last off pit road anyway, but she figured there were around 12 or 13 cars who stayed out there if she were to give an educated guess. They rode around a couple of laps before Dad came on the radio and said, "This one's the choose. Choose the inside unless I tell you otherwise." Tommie readied herself to swerve down the inside of the track when Dad came back on the radio and said, "Abort, abort, go outside." Without arguing, Tommie did what Dad suggested and swerved right to the outside of the orange painted-on cone just past the start-finish line. It leapfrogged her up a row back into 38th, her original starting position. With a momentary rest that didn't seem anywhere near long enough to Tommie, the field lined up yet again for the restart. The flagman displayed the green flag, and they were off yet again. Tommie, careful not to spin her tires this time, accelerated easily and shifted cautiously through the gears. This backed up her line behind her, but once she got up to race speed, she noticed a striking difference in how the car handled. The bumps seemed smoother, and she felt as if she were going faster than before, though she knew that she was probably in a similar ballpark, if not turning at the exact same speeds. There was a long green flag during which Tommie improved from her 38th restart position up to 24th, but it came slowly and not easily. She didn't know for sure if she was really the one passing cars, or if the handling of the other cars was just slipping while hers remained steadily the same. They ran so long that the drivers who stayed out had to pit and ended up going a lap down. The caution flag flew yet again, and Tommie could see the wreck in the rear view. Chad Duncan tangled with another car. The flagman displayed the yellow once again, and Tommie let off the gas, slowing. She came over the radio to her dad and asked, "Was that the leader who crashed behind me?" He was about half a straightaway back. Dad said, "Yep, Duncan, hate to see that. How many cars on the lead lap, Dad?" Dad was silent a moment as he counted through the field. He said, "Well, we're in 15th, so judging by the ones behind you, I'd say 18, give or take." 15th? For a moment, Tommie forgot about the school of cars that fed down into pit road halfway through the run. "Yeah, some strategy, along with the fact that you were passing cars left and right, was able to get us there. Great job, baby girl." "How many laps have we run?" Dad was silent again. Tommie could practically see him calculating. She smiled. "I think we're on lap 141. 10 from halfway, I think. Yes, confirmed, 10 from being halfway." "Are we pitting this time?" Tommie asked. "Affirmative, bring it down. Careful not to speed. I'd really like us to restart with the top 10 firmly in our view." 10-4, Tommie said. She wanted that too. She felt as if she were in a dream. The strategy of the cars who stayed out last time around wasn't working out, with many of them being trapped either one lap or several laps down. Therefore, when the field funneled down pit road this time, nearly the whole field came down. Tommie minded her speed and counted down along with Dad to the 15th pit stall. The gray-blue zombie men dashed over the wall, and they moved quickly, almost fast enough to where they looked like little blue blurs surrounding her car. They were done servicing her in seconds. While they worked, Tommie became aware again of the presence to her right, who just sat out of her sight. But the thought was ejected from her mind when the jack let down, and she raced back out in line and off pit road. Dad did his calculating silently. Then he came over the radio and said, "Looks like we're going to be restarting in 12th. Way to go, guys." "All right, great job," Tommie said and lined back up. When it came time to choose her lane for this restart, she went up to the outside, which advanced her a couple of rows. She would restart the race 4th in line on the outside and in the 8th position overall. They ran several more laps under caution, so many that she radioed over to her dad and asked him what the holdup was. "Debris," he said simply enough. "Phantom debris? I don't see anything," Carol chimed in. Phantom? Tommie mulled the word over, thinking of Bucky Blackwell and the Halloween machine. Tommie almost asked where the infamous number 31 was, but didn't. She was high enough in the lineup now that she could see him. With Duncan's issues, and possibly a brilliant pit stop, he was starting on the point on the inside of the front row. Then, without thinking, she said, "I'm coming for you." "What?" Dad asked. "Nothing," Tommie said, feeling the burn of embarrassment in her face. Still, she didn't take an eye off Blackwell's car up front. As they came to take 150 laps to go, the flagman readied himself. Then the green flag was flying. Tommie carefully shifted and accelerated into the first turn, which cost her a little bit of time at the line, but had made up most of it by the time she reached the third turn. At this point in the race, The bottom was still the preferred line, but the top was being rubbered. Tommie guessed that in time it'll be pretty sporty, too. Heck, it was already able to hang with the inside line everywhere except for the front row. Tommie could see Blackwell's car grow smaller and smaller in the windshield. It wouldn't be long before he vanished in the first turn while she was still trying to get up and off turn 4. After a while, they all settled into running the inside for the time being. Tommie filed into 9th and started clicking off laps in a comfortable rhythm. Judging by the tire wear of the first couple of runs, they'd have to make at least one more final pit stop. Dad was calculating when they ought to take the leap. He said they could split the run perfectly and pit with 75 laps to go, but wasn't entirely sure how the tires would be holding up towards the end of the race. Tommie suggested that pitting later would give her fresher rubber for the end of the race and make her more competitive. Dad argued that that was true, but didn't want to wait too long as it would put them way behind the drivers who pitted earlier. They decided mutually that they would pit with around 50 laps to go, maybe even staying out as long as 40 laps left, though that felt like pushing it a tad. However, all that strategy got thrown out the window when a caution flag flew with 60 laps to go. Like the first incident, Tommie saw this one in her rear view as well. Except rather than being a straightaway behind her, it was right behind her. As they turned green flag laps, Tommie began to pay more attention to her rear view. If Bucky Blackwell was coming along to put her a lap down, she wanted to see him coming so that she could prepare to be the toughest car he'd ever have to pass. He never made it to her, though. A driver named Jeremy Taylor was running 10th. By the looks of it, Blackwell got to his back bumper and just booted him out of the way. Taylor, who was driving a bright green and yellow number 34, threw it back to Days of Thunder and went around and made hard contact with the outside wall. It destroyed the back of his Toyota, crushing it up like a tin can. The flagman instantly displayed the caution flag and the field slowed. As the Halloween machine shrank in the rear view, Tommie breathed a sigh of relief. All the cards were on the table now. It was time to go all in. During pit stops, Tommie and her father elected only to change the right side tires, leaving scuffs on Amelia's left. They packed the Grey Ghost full of fuel and the race off pit road was on. In her mind, Tommie counted the cars in front of her, but as some swerved into their stalls while others left theirs, the numbers got all jumbled in her head. Mindful not to speed, she cruised down the length of the pit road to the yellow line at the end. From there, she let the cards lay where they may. Dad came over the radio and said, "Looks like we're P4, way to go, crew." Tommie cheered and repeated her father's words, fist pumping in the air. They lined up and waited for the lapped cars to come down and get service of their own. The Halloween machine felt close enough to touch. It sat there rocking back and forth across the track within reach. When it came time to choose, Tommie saw that the top was open. She had an opportunity to start on the outside next to Blackwell, but she wasn't about to pass up that opportunity. Not for 1 second. She swerved to the right side of the painted-on orange cone and confidently took the position of the front row outside as if making a statement. Or maybe a declaration. She was done being intimidated by Blackwell in a strangely indestructible race car. And if only at that moment she truly believed she was. She craned her neck to see the smug look on Blackwell's face, but the window net was in the way, obstructing her view. Tension seemed to wind inside her like a chain tightening around her throat as the field headed down the back stretch and into the third turn. The tightening only worsened as they entered and came out of the fourth corner. The flagman held the green flag all rolled up in his hand, and when the leaders entered the restart box, he let it fly. Tommie didn't waste time getting up through the gears and making sure the tires didn't spin this time. She gunned, praying she could stay with Blackwell at least through the first 2 turns. And that was exactly what she did. Amelia fired on all cylinders. Her engine boomed and growled to life as her tires quickly found their traction. The Grey Ghost and the Halloween machine remained, fighting side by side all down the backstretch and in and out of turns 3 and 4. Tommie thought that maybe, just maybe, she led that lap, but couldn't be entirely too sure. Dad neither confirmed nor denied her suspicion. He just let her and Amelia do their thing. Tommie and the Grey Ghost raced alongside the Halloween machine for a handful of laps, not really gaining an advantage, other than the occasional nose over the other. When they took 39 to go, she felt Blackwell drift up the track. She didn't see it, only felt it, but her instinct proved correct when he doored her coming onto the backstretch. She got up into the outside concrete wall and just barely kissed it. The impact brushed off some speed, but not enough to hinder her outside charge. He did the same in the third and fourth corners, although this time more aggressively and egregiously. The Halloween machine slammed hard into her left door this time, and they both washed up the track. Tommie braced for impact and knew this hit would be significantly harder and potentially race-ending. Then she felt a hand over her own. Through the world that seemed to be spinning out of control, she saw a nearly transparent blue hand cap her own. She tried to look to her right, but the Hans device prevented her from seeing who was there, but she knew. When she looked into that blue skin, she knew. Slater. With his help, she steered the car back into the groove, and his literal helping hand disappeared as easily and subtly as it came to assistance. She lost some ground on Blackwell, but he wasn't in the best of positions himself. When he washed up the track, it opened the door for David Smith's dogleg media car to slip in on the inside. Tommie fell comfortably into third place, her car firmly under her yet again, and watched the battle. At first, it seemed as though Smith might have had something for the infamous Halloween machine. Internally, Tommie cheered him on. Even if she couldn't win, she had had a great and steady race up to that point. Any outcome going forward would be acceptable so long as Blackwell was defeated when the checkered flag flew. David edged ahead of Blackwell, nearly clearing him as they headed into the first turn. But Blackwell wasn't going to take that line down. Tommie watched as the Halloween machine cut down the track ever so slightly, right-hooking Smith into the outside concrete wall. The caution flew instantly, and the head-on impact of Smith's number 25 Chevy echoed throughout the surrounding woods. Tommie was sure. "No!" she screamed inside, but started backing off the throttle. "Holy crap, back it down, Tommie, back it down," Dad said as he came over the radio. "I can't believe he did that." "I can," Carol said. "He's a scoundrel. Don't take that crap from him, Tommie. If he's going to dish out racing like that, he's going to have to learn to deal when he gets it right back." Tommie barely heard what either of them said, and her concerns and attention shifted to David Smith. She hoped he was all right, and she breathed a huge sigh of relief on the third caution lap after the incident when she saw him climb out from the steaming hunk of metal that used to be his race car. He was walking with a slight limp, but appeared otherwise unharmed. Thank God, Tommie thought, and filed in behind Blackwell in second. It took a long time to clean off the track and make sure that the wall wasn't damaged. As she rode there behind Bucky Blackwell, she stared in through his rear windshield, trying to get any glimpse of the man behind the myth and legend of the Halloween machine. But inside the car was far too foggy. Unless it was just her imagination, the air in there seemed to shimmer, almost like murky water upset by a constant tide. In the graininess, she made out certain figures swimming by. Near the driver's seat for a split second, she feared that she saw a glowing red slit eye. But it faded back into the depths even more quickly than it came. She pulled Amelia closer to the bumper of the Halloween machine and waited like a predator, ready to pounce. When it came time to make the choice, Tommie thought that it was a no-brainer to go outside again. But this time she had to get him. In the first corner, she either had to force him into a mistake himself or take him out. It really was that simple. The final lap before the green flag was once again displayed felt like an eternity. Dad came over the radio and said, "This is it, Tommie. There'll be 10 to go when we take the green. Be careful not to spin your tires. Good luck, honey. You've made your daddy proud." With a tear, she thanked her father and hoped that Carol would say a word or two. Carol did chime in. "You've got this, kid. Bring it home, honey, and we'll see you down in Victory Lane." 10-4 was all she could think to say. She bit down on her emotions, suppressing them deep within her. Her heartbeat started to ramp up again, and she grasped the steering wheel. "Pull them belts tight one more time," she heard the echo of Darrell Waltrip saying, ringing in her mind. They came out of the fourth turn and entered the restart box. Blackwell got a good jump. Tommie pressed the throttle down, and the car lurched, but then it lulled behind. She could feel the wheels spinning under her, unable to catch traction immediately. "Crap," she said, and Amelia started going after only a second of delayed response. But that single second felt like the end of everything. Before her very eyes, as she saw Bucky Blackwell and the Halloween machine clear her, she thought she saw everything fading away. "Get down, bottom of the track." His voice was unmistakable. Jerry Slater's hands reappeared over hers, and together they tugged the wheel, filling in the gap between Blackwell and third place. "Throw it down in the corner as low as it'll go, even on the apron if you have to," Slater told her, and they did. Together they yanked the wheel to the left, and the gray ghost ran down onto the apron. As they entered turn 1, she was under Blackwell. She glanced at his window net, and through the diamond gaps, she thought she saw a perplexed, skinless skull staring dumbfounded at her with fire in his eyes. Amelia didn't stick down low. She drifted up the track but caught herself on the door of the Halloween machine. A tire on the number 31 car exploded like a gunshot. Before Tommie could fully understand what had happened, the Halloween machine was no longer beside her. It was the star apprentice in her rear view. In the mirrors, Tommie assumed the lead, and Jerry faded away from her. She saw Bucky Blackwell back his infamous car into the outside concrete wall, just where he had sent David Smith laps earlier. Impossibly, a bolt of lightning from the heavens cracked open a fractured black sky. It hit Blackwell's car with such force that it seemed to jar the earth. The next thing Tommie knew was a brilliant white light washing over her. It was like going into a secluded tunnel made entirely of dead lights, and when she arrived on the other side, everything was dark and quiet. Like the wink of her eye, one minute she was racing and taking the lead. The flagman was preparing to display the yellow flag, and Bucky Blackwell was crashed into the outside wall in turns 1 and 2. The next moment, she was sitting in a field with someone. Darkness engulfed her, and trees surrounded her. In the rear view now, she could make out the vague blackness of other cars parked in the woods. Dad and Carol rushed over to her and took her window net down. It was startling, to be honest, but Tommie was glad to see them. "What the heck just happened?" Dad asked. "I don't know," Carol said, "but Groovy Hollow Raceway—" "It's gone," she said. Tommie took off her helmet and unfastened her belts. She climbed out of Amelia and sat perched on her window. She looked around. Carol was right. Groovy Hollow Raceway had vanished for the second time in her troubled history. And with, like the last time, she took Bucky Blackwell and his Halloween machine with her. Epilogue. Nobody covered the 4th annual Groovy Hollow 300 after the fact. When Bucky Blackwell, his demonic race car, and the track winked back into the void from which they came, the live stream of the event ended abruptly in a snow blizzard of TV static. No websites reported on the winner, and no papers covered it save for the Nowhere Chronicles, which could be found on the same wire racks as all the other tabloids sold in Dollar General stores and gas stations. In them, though, no winner was ever referenced. Moreover, the stories were just about the track, its strange history, and the peculiar misfit race car driver named Bucky Blackwell and his lean, mean Halloween machine. On Racing Reference, the driver credited with the win was none other than Tommie Jo Swanson, who never received a trophy or a payout. She didn't even consider herself the winner, not really, because in the end, Blackwell escaped, and the race, unfinished, would always be deemed unofficial. The end.
Thank you for tuning in to The Legend of Groovy Hollow audiobook. Thank you to Cody Williams and Jillian Cool, AE Engine and the Daily Downforce, and of course, all of you out there in the Groovy Gang. Thank you for continuing to support Groovy Hollow and our great causes every year. The Legend of Groovy Hollow is a novel written by Cody Williams and performed by Jillian Cool. Groovy Hollow is a production of Out of the Groove, the Daily Downforce, and AE Engine. For more great content like this, visit dailydownforce.com.